Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Simon, for those kind words, and thank you, Aaron, also for the invitation. I'm very honored to be among you today. I will speak for about an hour, and then you cannot trust me. That's what Simon didn't say. Don't trust me, but I'll try to speak for an hour, and I would like to have a discussion with you for the remaining time. It's wonderful to be back at UCLA, see some old friends, meet some new faces, and talk a little bit about part of the book. So let me see how this works. I start with an advertisement. I'm sorry. There are lots of things that Simon didn't tell you about my the dark side of me. But those of you who know me well wonder why I ever wrote such a book. And one of the answers is that when you get the Nobel Prize, things happen to you. And I'm not kidding. It's a wonderful experience. I recommend. But but you get stopped in the streets, and people ask you, tell us about your science. Is economics useful? What are you up to? Can you explain in what sense it can serve the common good? I even got questions from journalists. Isn't that an oxymoron? So it's actually. I thought it was very important. All the more that something I'd thought about for a long time is very present. Market economies are completely dominant all over the world, and maybe North Korea doesn't fit, but by and large, we all live in market economies. But at the same time, it hasn't won hearts and minds in a sense. So lots of people actually think, well, they are resigned to have a market economy, and they don't really like it in some sense. The world is not for sale. The big slogan that you find everywhere. So it may be saying something about our ability to communicate what we do. Maybe we don't always do the right thing also, but it's one of the things that. So I wanted to write a book and try to explain the reasons for that distrust. So I spent a fair amount in the book, a fair amount of time explaining what kind of what we do wrong, maybe, what kind of cognitive bias come in the way of explaining economics and more generally science, actually, because it's not only economics which is at stake right now in those populist times. Anytime you are working in a field which has some interaction with policymaking, you get into some trouble. I mean, of course, we got into trouble with the financial crisis, but it's more general. If you are in climate science or biology or medicine or whatever, you are going to actually face a lot of difficulties in communicating what you do. So in that book, I try to define the common good, and especially I try to explain how economics can actually be helpful achieving this common good. And for that, of course, I have to discuss a lot of market failures, and there are many, many market failures. In theory, the organization of our society is very simple. You have market failures, and the government is supposed to correct market failures, right? It's very simple. But in practice, of course, the government fails as well. So it's actually much more complicated. And it fails in many dimensions, including this world we are, you the younger people are inheriting with all the problems about public debt, unemployment, inequality, poor education, a lack of preparation for the digital upheaval that is going to follow. And many other things like climate change, of course, a topic we don't act enough, or almost none at all, to fight climate change. So today, actually, I want to focus, there are many chapters in the book. Last piece of advertising, there are 17 chapters. You can read each chapter independently. You don't need to go to page 600 to know what to think about it. You can read each chapter separately. But, so I had to choose one of the topics. And I chose, to talk about the digital economy, which mainly chapter 15 of the book, precisely because I think that's one of the areas where we economists have not done our homework. So don't expect me to explain to you what to do. I'm going to ask questions, give you a few ideas, but don't expect to get out of this room and knowing everything we should be doing about the digital economy. Actually, one of my themes is that we need to do homework, so we are not doing enough to do the right thing. So just as an aside, anytime you have a technological revolution, lots of people are going to be impacted. The consumers, of course, in general, is going to be good because they will get lower prices, they will get better products, but sometimes with bad consequences. So one of the things, for example, that worries me about the current evolution will be the increased possibility of risk selection insurance. I mean, you know that, behind the veil of ignorance, we would like to get some insurance against the risk of having the bad genes. But of course, once you start risk selecting in very disguised way, the insurance, actually that's the Hirschleifer effect, right? The insurance is going to go down the drain, and it's a very bad idea to get that. You could have crowd lending platforms without equity, doing the job of a bank without equity of their own. I mean, there are various, anytime you have a market, you'll have very nice aspects, but you always have some market failure you have to deal with. For the firms, it's of course a big impact as well, because the incumbents are always afraid of facing competition of new entrants. So almost every industry now is going to be disrupted by this. And by the way, whatever you think about Uber, and Uber has a dark side as well, but here is the role of competition. If you look at what Uber has done, the innovation is extremely minor. It's really epsilon. Everything existing, ratings, credit cards, geolocation, I mean, everything existed before. But all the taxi monopolies, none of them have done anything about it. So that shows you the impact of competition. You need competition to actually get innovation, and innovation is not always rocket science, just like Uber shows you. And I'm not talking about other aspects of Uber, but the role of competition is very important. And of course, something we won't have much time to talk about is how it will impact workers. And actually, I'm very worried about that. The increase in polarization and what might happen to our world. I mean, we'll live in a much richer world and we'll be much healthier, but at the same time, there is a big societal challenge there. Now, are we up to that challenge? That's what I'm going to discuss. So let me actually maybe discuss a little bit the outline before I go further. There are lots of very important topics we are not going to discuss. We can touch on them during the Q&A session if you'd like. Fiscal policies, of course, are very important. Labor market policy, political leverage of those big platforms, and all kinds of issues having to do with segmentation of regulation, different treatments for different firms, and so on. There is a bunch of issues. Then all those issues actually have some impact on competition in various ways. What we're going to do is actually to focus on a narrow set of questions. And even so, I'm going to show you how little we know about those questions, okay? Sorry, it's not a great pitch for the talk, but this is something I feel strongly about. Challenges for antitrust, dealing with data, privacy issue, and I'll try to give you an economic analysis and then rethinking regulation, okay? So, sorry, I'm going back a little bit, but in terms of competition policy, there are many challenges. As you know, nowadays, you have a lot of concentration in many industries, in particular in platform industries. You know that the 7 largest firms in the world are two-sided platforms. 5 are American, 2 are Chinese, and they benefit from direct externalities, meaning I'm on Facebook because you're on Facebook, or indirect externalities, which is a case, I don't care per se that you are on Waze, but the fact that you're on Waze means that Waze is more precise in predicting traffic. So you tend to have a winner-take-all economy because of those network externalities. And of course, that means that firms are willing to pay a lot in order to actually be the monopolist. Now, lots of people are saying, why don't we regulate Google? Why don't we regulate Facebook? Or maybe why don't we break up Facebook and Google? Um, you know, we have done that in the past. It's called regulation, public utility regulation, where we have done both some kind of regulation of profit and breaking up the firms. Public utility regulation is very hard to achieve. You know, we have done that for telecoms, railroads, and electricity, gas, and so on. But it's pretty hard to do in the case of the new economy. To be sure, there are similar features. So, you know, if you think about all those digital firms, they are very high fixed cost, like utilities. Marginal cost is often zero. So it looks like a public utility. But of course, you know, the basic thing about regulation is to have some kind of cost recovering mechanisms. And for that, you must measure profit, which we know for those firms is very hard to do for several reasons, including international transfers. But also, like drug companies, there is the issue about that you have to estimate the probability of succeeding, right? So there might be 1 out of 10 that succeeds, and you know, and it's a very skewed distribution. It's like drugs in a sense. And if you want to regulate profitability, you also have to think about what was the ex-ante probability of succeeding, which of course we don't observe. It's not like an electricity company. There is one electricity company, it's going to succeed in quote, right? It's there, but it's much harder. Some people have suggested to break up firms. So lots of people are suggesting that now. So we have multiple Googles, multiple Facebooks, and we have done that in the past. So for example, in 1984, we broke up AT&T, and we identified the essential facility, basically the part of the network which everybody needs access to because it's very hard to duplicate. So in the case of AT&T, it was the local network, the local loop, and that gave rise to the baby bells, and the baby bells were prohibited from integrated into long-distance services. In the case of electricity network, it could be the transmission grid, because of course you cannot have 2 or 3 transmission grids, you have only one. And then if you are a generator, you need access to the transmission grid. For railroad, you cannot duplicate the tracks and stations, okay? So this is the essential facility, and then you can basically cut it from the rest of the firm and having lines of business restrictions. Now, if you wanted to do that with Google, for example, and nobody has a clear view. The advocate and the anti don't really have a clear view. What you'll have to do is to identify what the essential facility is. It might be search, for example, okay? And then you'll have to take search away from the other services and make it into a separate company and guarantee the access of everyone to that search thing. Now, it's not clear search will work as well, by the way. It's not, you can take, you know, railroad tracks and station away, and it's still going to work, even if the firm is not integrated into train operations. But search is different because, you know, if you don't have YouTube or Waze, there's much less you know about the consumer, and the search engine is not going to be as efficient. So that's the thing, is they have a common input, which are the data, and, you know, is it going to work? And the other thing is that those industries are moving very fast. If you think about the telecom operators until 1984, or the electricity industry or the railroads, the technology has been the same for 1 century. And even so, it took 3 or 4 years to basically cut those into pieces. So it's hard actually to do it when the technology changes all the time. That's one point of view. I'm not saying I'm right, and a number of people disagree with that, but you know, my gut feeling is that competition policy and consumer protection are the main game in town. See me in 5 years, I may admit I'm wrong, but you know, that's a possibility. But of course, we economists must actually help decision makers to design the new policy environment, okay? So let me start with the challenges for antitrust. I told you that we very often have monopolies, right? Google or Facebook have huge market shares, and they look very much like monopolies or maybe tight oligopolies, okay? Now, we know from economics that monopolies may be okay, not that bad, as long as their market is contestable. So what do I mean by contestability? Simply that if you have a more efficient entrant who comes in, this entrant actually can come in and also will come in, which is not the same thing. I will explain why. So basically, the idea is that if you have contestability, so if you can replace the incumbent when you are more efficient, then the incumbent actually has to innovate, which monopolies usually are not very good at, don't have the incentive to. And furthermore, will charge low prices because to deter entry, you like to have the biggest possible install base. So actually, a monopolist who is kept on its toes actually may do things which are not that bad for society. But there are two big ifs, as I mentioned. It must be the case that the entrants in this competition for the market be able to enter and also is going to enter when able to. Okay? Second remark I want to make is that the entry usually concern only a niche segment, a small segment. Actually, the giants of today, they entered a very specialized segment. Amazon was just selling books online. Google just did a search engine before being what Google is now, right? And you can go on and on. You know, and if I had to bet, Uber is not entering the taxi business. That's not what Uber is up to. You enter a product line, and then you expand this product line, and sometimes you may even grow into a substitute for the monopoly segment. But it's very important that you can enter on a niche market, okay? And that suggests that bundling tie-ins or loyalty rebates or predation will be barriers to entry, and we have to avoid that if we want to let entry happen. Okay? So that brings me to my first point, is that we have to err on the side of competition and protect fair access. And in a sense, we are back to the essential facility doctrine, which was built in 1912 in the US by the Supreme Court. In 1912, the Supreme Court decided to give access to the St. Louis Terminal Railroad, so that was a bridge and a station and tracks, so as to have competition for trains getting into St. Louis. So it's back to the essential facility doctrine, okay? And right now there's a lot of debate, and I'm not taking side because I haven't studied those, but people have said that, for example, Google as a preference, gives preference for its own services. Actually, in the EU, you had a $2.7 billion fine on Google. Now there's a pending Android case. There's been alleged behavior by Amazon of predation on some segments. You could have other behaviors which are not fine. I'm not taking a stand on that because I've not studied them, but basically that's something that in the EU people are concerned about. Now, I'll come back to that. In the US, antitrust is very, very lenient. If you compare the US to Europe, it's very different. I'm not saying that Europe is necessarily doing the right thing, but I'm just saying I'm sure the US is doing the wrong thing because the US is really way too lenient in terms of antitrust, okay? By the way, there is a new proposed regulation in Europe, so those of you who are interested in that, it was proposed 2 weeks ago, and basically trying to make discrimination more transparent. So notice here that the European Union is not actually going against discrimination on some market niche. It's allowing those giants to discriminate, but they have to explain why they are discriminating. So for example, Google's search ranking. You know, why is that I'm only on the 4th page? Why is that? If it wants to exclude users, so if Booking, for example, says, you know, I'm not referencing this this hotel, for example, you know, what if I'm delisting sellers and so on. Preferred partners programs, they are very big. You have to explain why. You have to define at least a broad principle. What a broad principle is, I have no clue. But of course, you know, the question there is, how can you explain that you delist a seller without giving all the details of your algorithm, all your trade secrets? Right? You could basically explain that I'm delisting you. How do I explain that, why I'm doing that, without basically giving you all my secrets? What about internally supplied services, right? How do you deal with that? Very often those platforms favor their own services. And so it's not clear. The important thing, I think, is actually this redress process where, you know, at least the big firm will have to have, the big platforms will have to have some internal process, an internal committee, and then there will be a mediation process, and finally, if that doesn't work, you'll go to court. Because one of the things which is very hard for the sellers is that when they are delisted from Google or Booking or whatever, or Amazon, then they're in big trouble, right? They're in big trouble for their business. And by the time that goes to court, they are dead, right? And it's actually a very complicated thing for them to do. So just for those who are interested. Second thing is that it may be very difficult to unscramble the eggs. You know, I told you, breaking up Google or Facebook into pieces is not that easy. But you may not want the eggs to be scrambled in the first place, right? So one thing we can do probably is to be a bit more cautious when we accept mergers. So Facebook purchased Instagram and WhatsApp. Those are social networks. So you might think that Instagram and WhatsApp could become, they were not really competitors, but they could become competitors to Facebook very easily. And the problem is that you cannot prove it. And that's a difficulty, because in the US, you have to prove, actually DOJ or the FTC has to make a case that actually Instagram and WhatsApp are going to compete, if there is no merger, are going to compete with Facebook. And you know, it's in the future, you have to change the application, transform it into a Facebook. You cannot prove anything. It's just, there's no data for that. There's no way you can do that. So potential competition is very complex to assess. I mean, remember the Microsoft case in the 90s or the early 2000s. The Microsoft case was a case of bundling the browser, Internet Explorer browser, with the operating system. Okay. At the time, so those who complain were what became Mozilla. Help me. No. The Netscape. Thank you. So some people remember Netscape. That's good. So yeah, I mean, Netscape actually became an open source program afterward, and it became Mozilla. So anyway, so Netscape sued Microsoft for bundling the operating system with a browser. Now, there was no question at the time that actually the browser was a complement to the operating system. In that sense, the merger was perfectly fine. It was a vertical merger. There's no issue about merging the browser with Internet, with the operating system. The concern at the time, I don't know whether it was right or wrong, but the concern was that actually the Netscape browser, by adding lines of code, could become a new operating system and could break the Microsoft monopoly. So, you know, this is the kind of thing that perhaps Instagram or WhatsApp will have basically competed with Facebook. We don't know, but it's potential competition. So, it's very hard to block the acquisition. The other criticism is that, when you have a startup, you have two exit mechanisms, both for the entrepreneur and for the VCs, the venture capitalists. And those if you prevent sales of your firm to the incumbents, then the only thing that is left is an IPO. Or maybe you can sell it to someone who is not actually a potential competitor. I don't think this argument is very strong, partly because what you observe too much is what's called entry for buyout. Entry for buyout means that you enter and you basically threaten the incumbent and then you sell to the incumbent. And that's socially not very helpful. You're just basically extracting the rent of the incumbent. You mimic what the incumbent is doing in some ways, you threaten the incumbent, and then you sell to the incumbent. Where's the benefit for the consumer? None, right? You're just basically blackmailing the incumbent. So it's not that great, I think. Okay? By the way, I don't know if you want to ask questions along the way or you want to wait until the end to complain. Okay. But feel free anyways if you want to stop me. The other thing I want to mention is that we want to protect competition in some way. And one of the things we'd have to think about, and I have nothing to offer, but I just want to raise the issue, is to think in privacy, which we're going to discuss in a minute, in terms of competition as well. Because there will be always a tension between privacy and competition. So, for example, the open regulation frowns upon sharing of data or resale of data. That sounds good because if you want to protect privacy, you don't want firms to keep reselling their data to some others, right? Because that means the data are all over the place and there's no way to enforce privacy laws. The problem with that, it's well-meaning, there's no question about it. The problem with that is that if you prohibit data resale, who is going to be able to compete? Google and Facebook, period. Because no one will be able to assemble enough data to actually offer the new AI services and the like. They're already very powerful today, but the day you prohibit data resale, then it's basically those firms which are giants and they do everything internally who are going to be able to compete, okay? And you're also going to move data collection analysis in-house. But there's a problem is that if you want to protect privacy, you may actually restrict competition, which is not something we feel very, very secure about. The other thing is if you want to empower consumers and you tell them, watch out, before you give your data, make sure it's a trusted party. Now, who are you going to give a consent to? Only the big firms right? You're not going to give your consent to arbitrary websites. The small ones you're going to be worried about. So again, you're going to reinforce, entrench incumbents. So I have nothing very interesting to say about that, but keep it in the back of your mind as being an issue, okay? But then we have to reinvent antitrust. So part of antitrust, it's a long history of antitrust, but there are new issues. Actually, this one is not completely new, but it has become very big recently with the two-sided platforms. Which is something, by the way, when you're an economist and you want to demonstrate the value of economists, it's always good to explain why our first intuition, our heuristics, lead us astray. And that's the issue with best price guarantees. I apologize, there are at least 6 or 7 names for those. The most common one is called a most favored nation clause. But it has also called price parity, no surcharge rule, best price guarantee or whatnot. So let me give you an example. Anyone uses Booking.com here? Yes, I'm sure, lots of people. Nice service. I do too. I use Booking.com. It's nice. I'm not getting any fee from Booking.com, especially given what I'm going to say next. But it's a nice service, and you get most of the hotels, and you are guaranteed the best price. So if you go to Expedia or if you call the hotel directly, you won't get a better price. So you're on a platform where basically all the hotels are, and you are assured of getting the best price. And how can you dream of a better thing, right? You get the best possible price, and you get all the hotels on the same website, plus some nice services and recommendations. So that's wonderful. How can you object to that? Okay? So, that's our first heuristic. It sounds very good. Now, if you look at it a little bit differently, here you have Booking.com. Sorry, Booking.com is here. That's you and me. We are the platform user. I don't know what the market share in the US. Let's say 20%. I'm not sure what the market share is in the US. But, we are the users. We go to Booking.com, and we reserve an hotel room. Okay? Now, Booking.com goes and sees the hotels and says, look, I have unique customers. What does it mean? That means that those customers are unique to my platform. They don't go anywhere else. Why? They don't go anywhere else because they get the lowest price on the platform, so there's no reason to go anywhere else. So those are unique customers. And because they are unique customers, if you want to reach them, there is only one channel. That's me, Booking.com. Okay? So I can ask you for any price. I'm going to ask you for a merchant fee, which could be 25% or whatever. Because if you want to have access to those customers of mine, then you have to basically accept all the terms and conditions I'm going to dictate to you. I can ransom you. Okay? Now, here is a twist. If that amount of money were passed through to the booking customer, that would be perfectly fine. But it's not. And it's one of the rare examples where a firm can tax its rivals. It's amazing. Every firm dreams of being able to tax its rival, right? But that's exactly what's going on here. Because of the best price guarantee, the merchant is going to charge the same price, whether you use Booking, whether you are a platform non-user, so you might be Expedia, or you may go directly to the hotel website. And because the merchant charges a unique price, single price, basically those ones are going to pay also for the merchant fee, which is demanded by Booking.com. Okay? So in particular, let's say Booking.com has 20% market share. That means that 80% of the fee demanded by Booking.com is going to be paid by people who don't use Booking.com. Okay? So you tax your rivals. And it's a wonderful strategy, right? It's a very exciting strategy. Because, and by the way, Expedia does the same thing to Booking, right? Everybody does that. Amazon does that, and so on, right? So, two remarks. The first is, that's one of the rare examples in which we are at least as worried by small platforms than by big ones. If you have 100% of the market share, the pass-through is entirely to your own customers. That's fine. If you have 2% market share, that means 98% of your fee is passed through to people who don't use your platform. So actually, there's actually more market power by small platforms. Okay? And in typical antitrust theory or practice, the defendant will assert that high market share is necessary condition for harm. But that's not the case here. If you are a small platform, you can do a lot of harm as well. Okay? Second point I want to make is that not everything is bad about those most favored nation clauses. And we know of two reasons for why actually we may want to have something like that. One is showrooming. So showrooming is simply, you go to Booking.com, and it's usually used for trying a car or something like that, but you go to Booking.com, you find on Booking.com the dream hotel, the hotel you dreamed of. And then if you don't have most favored nation clause, you may think it might be cheaper on the hotel website. And therefore, you exit Booking.com and then you make the reservation on the hotel website, and then Booking is expropriated from its investment. The other reason why we may actually want to have a most favored nation clause is that we don't want to have an expropriation of the consumer's investment. So how many of you have gone to a low-cost airline? They have spent a lot of time looking for what they wanted, the flight they wanted, and the last screen, it's always the last screen, where you want to pay by card, it's a surcharge of $10 or $15. And in Europe, it has been common, for example. So the most favored nation clause basically says that was applied by credit cards, payment cards, most payment card issuers for a long time, basically said, by the way, there is an Amex case pending right now, which is going to be very interesting. But basically said you are not allowed to charge more by when there is a payment by card than when there is a payment by cash. So here the platform will be Visa or MasterCard or American Express or PayPal or Google Wallet or something. And then the platform user will be you, and then the most favored nation clause is a no surcharge rule. You cannot charge more for payment by card than payment by cash or check. Okay? So that's it. So what I'm saying is that most favored nation clauses are bad. Okay? At the same time, they also have a logic. So it doesn't quite suffice to say they are prohibited. There also are good reasons, actually, to have most favored nation clause. So we economists, our duty is to help competition authorities to do better, right, and advise them. So actually, if you look at the remedies, that's been a big thing in Europe. So Booking.com, actually, Emmanuel Macron in France had a law preventing, when he was finance minister, preventing Booking.com from using MFN. In Germany, the same. Amazon abandoned the MFN clause in the UK and Germany under pressure. In the US, nothing. Nothing. There is no move whatsoever to do anything about MFNs. Okay? By the way, it's going to be all over the place again, with the new thing. So how many of you have Alexa at home or Google Home? You don't? Okay, so tomorrow you say, Alexa, find me a doctor. Alexa, find me a driver. Alexa, find me this and that. Now what's going to happen, of course, is that Alexa, Amazon will ask for 25% of whatever, and will take its cut, knowing that you have your Alexa at home, and if the doctor or the driver wants to reach you, well, you need an agreement with Amazon, right? So it's going to be all over the place. Now, that structural remedies basically are just some kind of prohibition of the most favored nation clause. Another approach is a price cap. That's what we did in the EU. So in the payment card business, for Visa and MasterCard, for example, in the EU, there's a cap on surcharging, and it's just obeying PIGU. So you all know about PIGU for the environment, but the more general Pigovian insight is that you want to make people accountable for whatever externalities they create on other people. So when you are deciding as a consumer to pay by card or to pay by cash, you have to internalize a merchant's thing. So the idea is basically the European Union has this rule that you cap the surcharge at the level of the merchant fee. I'm sorry, the merchant fee, I'm sorry, not the surcharge. The merchant fee at the merchant's convenient benefit, so the benefit that the merchant gets from using a card as opposed to cash. It's not easy to measure, but they have ways of measuring that. So that's one example in which theoretical research has informed, but the policy. But I will say more generally, if you ask me, what is the right fee for Booking.com? Is that 25%, 18%, 4%? I will just say, well, I don't know. And is that helpful for authorities? No. We need to do homework, right? We need to help the competition authorities to actually have the right policies. And we are not there yet. Okay? Okay. So let me skip algorithmic trading. It's fun. But let me say a few things about data, because I really want to have some time to discuss all those things with you. Okay, data. We care about privacy, or at least we pretend we do, right? It's very interesting when you look at, people are always say it matters a lot to me, and we actually behave very differently. Oh, by the way, I'm like that. So I feel very strongly about privacy, but if you see me use a computer, I click all the time. And, I never read any consent form. I probably give my children to the other party. I don't know what I'm doing, but I just want to go very quickly to the website. Okay? And by the way, I will not understand anything in this consent form anyway. So in Europe, again, there is some difference with the US, but here are a few things that people agree on, some consent, of course. The right to be forgotten, we'll discuss that. The right of rectification of wrong data, which seems obvious, but what is a wrong data? Okay, and we know what a fake news is, but still, what is a wrong thing? Sometimes it's completely clear, sometimes it's more ambiguous. The right of access, the right to know what's made of your data. And of course, increased security in the new law. There's a new law which is called GDPR in Europe, which will be enforced starting May 25th. You have 72 hours, basically, to contact your customers and tell them there has been a breach of security. Okay? But of course, those are very nice general principles, and I'll give you an economic analysis of that. But, in the end, the devil is in the details. And again, I don't think we are doing enough to try to help regulatory authorities. So we need to think about the hidden costs for the users and the firms. I mean, that's totally obvious to me. We need to think about this hidden cost. I don't want to spend the rest of my life looking at consent forms, right? And by the way, I don't want the firms. I'm chairman of an organization, which is TSE and IST, which is small and medium enterprise. And I don't want all the people in my institution to spend their life thinking about erasing the stuff which was on the conference program and the like. So I don't want to spend, the burden of complying can be big. We don't want to throw the baby with the bathwater. So we don't want it to be the case that all those consents are actually destroying the wonderful services we get. And imagine a case, for example. Let me just give you an example. Imagine that you go to Waze. I guess many of you are using Waze. It's so good, of course, because many of you are using Waze, right? And you get a consent form. Do you allow us to track your car? Okay? If you ask me, I would say no. Probably you will do that as well. You don't want your car to be located all the time. So everybody says no. What is the use of Waze then? Zero. It's of no use, because all the value of Waze actually comes from tracking the car to predict the traffic jams, right? And tell you which road to take. So it's just a very simple example, but when we move to AI and all those things, we have to think about what's going to happen. We can think of abuses of the right to be forgotten. So you don't want a corrupt politician all at once to disappear and run for election, and nobody knows that this politician has been corrupt, right? So how do you define the right to be forgotten? So I don't know. Right now, just an aside, data ownership basically belongs to the firms. So it's called the services for data arrangement. So you go to YouTube, or you use YouTube or Waze or whatever, and then Google gets all the data. You use Android, by the way. You do use an app on Android, Google gets all the data. And the app owner too, right? So, and of course, if the product is free, you have the product, right? So that's the story. And whether it's an optimal arrangement, we have no clue. We don't know how to think about alternatives. I mean, people have thought about pure concurrent pricing, but then you might throw the baby with the bathwater because you want those services to be informed by data. I mean, think about targeted advertising. I don't like advertising, but given that I get advertising, I want it to be targeted. I just don't want random stuff, right? It makes no sense. We could compensate users through micropayments. Some people have said that. So basically, the platform will be paying users in cash rather than in kind. Right now, it pays in kind through YouTube and Waze and so on. This is difficult because there is gaming. If you pay people to give their data, then you'll have robots basically getting all the money, and that would be making no sense whatsoever. And it's also hard, how do you know what your data is worth? Can you put a number on your data? Okay? For what service? For what, who knows? So anyway, so there are discussions about trusted intermediaries, which might be nice. Also, they add one more layer of intermediation, so they're going to take their cut in there. So let me think as an economist now. As I mentioned, there is this big thing that, when we are asked, we say, oh, price is very important to me, and the way we act is very different. We put almost no value on our privacy. Let me just discuss. The first thing we're worried about is surplus extraction. So Google will know so much about me that Google is able to predict I'm willing to pay $11 for that. And actually, I'm willing to pay $11.50, so I have no surplus, basically. It's first-degree price discrimination, sorry. It's first-degree price discrimination, and basically the platform extracts your entire surplus. Second thing we are worried about is the platform's inadequate dissemination policies. So there might be too much leakage of various forms. It might be the case that there's a leakage with uninformed consent. So Facebook uses your data in ways that you were not planning to have. Okay, that's the one. Even if you have informed consent, you ask, where are those partners, and so on. And you, of course, have insufficient investment in security. Okay, the standard of care is too small. You might need higher liability for breach of security. Okay? Third point is that even if you don't give your consent, the platforms may still know a lot about you. So even if you refuse to give your data, the platforms may know a lot about you because they have your social graph, your social network, right? So they may get some of your emails. They know who your friends are and so on. So even if you don't give your consent, there is actually the platform may actually have a lot of information about you, so you cannot escape. Okay. Some of you may have read the book The Circle. Anyone has read The Circle? Some of you, right? Where someone is trying to escape, and that's hard. You cannot escape because your social network is there. Okay, so if you don't like it, that's it. And actually, there's a recent paper by Jean T Rirole and Kim. I don't remember the third author, but which is about the fact that you lower the reservation utility of consumers by actually having a data collection system as opposed to pure content pricing system. Okay. Now, let's think a little bit about why we care, or we pretend we care. The first is divisive issues. So we don't like people to have information about their sexuality, or religions, or politics, and so on. Because that may mean that, blackmailers or employers may actually do policies which are not socially optimal, not to mention governments. You know, if I'm a political opponent, actually, you know, that might be bad if the regime knows I'm a political opponent, except in a healthy democracy, which tend to disappear nowadays, unfortunately. Second issue is that there can be a breakdown of insurance, which I mentioned. You know, in Europe, we have rules in countries where healthcare is provided by the private sector, in Germany, in Switzerland, in the Netherlands, that health insurers are not allowed to price discriminate. So they are not allowed to actually use the fact that you are high risk of cancer or something like that to have you pay much more. But there are lots of ways of doing that very discreetly. So, you know, you can look at, you know, people who have reserved a table for 4 people at the restaurant at 7 p.m. And, you know, they have made analysis. They know everything about you. They know whether you're a health risk, whether you already have some kind of condition or something like that. And they can make a non-discriminatory offer, basically saying, you know, people who have reserved a table of 4 for 4 at 7 p.m. today at this restaurant will be entitled to a low health insurance scheme, right? Which is, of course, a disguised way of doing price discrimination because they know exactly who was at the table. Because they have the emails, they have the reservation, they have everything. And they have studied your health risk, right? So, you know, that's the kind of thing we're worried about. Something which is very important in democracy is the right to be forgotten. You know, in law, you commit a misdeed, you are punished, and then this is forgotten, right? Why? Because you have to start with a clean slate. If you don't start with a clean slate, that means nobody will want to employ you, you won't have neighbors who will be nice to you, and so on. And that means that your social life is destroyed. That means that you will remain a criminal for the rest of your life. So it's very important that after punishment, people be able to start with a clean slate, restore incentives. But of course, with the new economy, it's going to be very hard because it's going to be all over the place, right? So that's really an issue. And I also think that there is an optimal segmentation of life into subdomains. You know, you want to separate different aspects of your life sometimes, okay? So that's why we care about data dissemination. But of course, the platforms are actually often misbehaving, but we consumers are also sometimes misbehaving in a sense, as a reaction. So sometimes we want to have our cake and eat it too. So we want to get all those wonderful services for free, but we may actually block ads, basically not participate, not reading web pages, or not supplying useful information, and so on. So, you know, it's a quid pro quo. So, you know, we actually want to get all those free services, but not give our data. Okay. Now, let me just, you know, for the interest of time, let me come to this point number 3, which I feel very strongly about. Now, I've never tested this, and I would like to retest that with you. And maybe that will show how French I am. But, you know, basically, I think that we need more regulation. I don't think, you know, in terms of prices, that self-regulation is going to work. Okay. Let me just give you an analogy. Everybody has a bank. Everybody puts his or her money as deposits in a bank. And we count on the regulator when they are around, which was not the case in 2005, 2006, but we count on regulators to actually do the job of monitoring that the bank doesn't go bankrupt, and that's the whole idea of prudential regulation and prudential supervision. Now, you could say, why do we need a regulator? You know, I could be, every night, I could spend a night going to the website. If I had access to my bank's balance sheet and off-balance sheet activities, I could try to understand what kind of trade my bank is doing, and probably I could also look at the solvency of counterparties of my banks, the correlation of this. I could get a PhD to do that and spend every night doing that. And then, you know, if at 3 a.m. I'm not satisfied, I just take my money and I run. And that will create the discipline. Now, is that the life you want? I mean, imagine it were possible. Is that the life you want to have? And I would say same thing for food safety regulation, right? You don't want to inspect and monitor the quality of all the food you eat in restaurants or you buy in a supermarket. You rely on the government to do that for you. And I would say, you know, data are very complicated. You know, the European regulation that is starting on May 25th basically says you need to give your consent for the uses of your data. So if Aaron's website, I went to Aaron's website, and Aaron, I know, is going to actually give my data to 150 other websites, right? Web companies. They all have names I've never heard of, right? And what are they going to do with my data? So I have no information about that. So sure, I can give consent to Aaron saying it's fine to transfer to number 37, but not to 38. But you know, how much information? And it's going to change every other week, by the way. You know, the counterparties change all the time. And what for? For how long? You know, it's mind-boggling. It's totally mind-boggling. Aaron, you had a question. Now, I've picked on your website.
Referring to the banking regulation, I believe that before the 2008 crisis, bank regulation forced some banks to buy those toxic mortgages, and what was considered AAA then turned out to be AAA. So sometimes regulation will be always, so by itself,
No, I completely agree. My view of the financial crisis in 2008, and I don't want to exonerate economists and the banks, but it's a massive government failure. And this is, I think, you know, you see it in many countries. I mean, best example is, actually the US is a good example too, but Spain is a wonderful example. The Bank of Spain, believe it or not, was one of the best regulators in the world. And by 2005, they said, look at this bubble in real estate. It was just like in the US. Look at this bubble in real estate. This is very dangerous. We have to do something. But the regulator actually was a supervisor, but didn't have the authority actually to intervene. And the federal government and the local governments wanted the real estate boom to continue. So they said, bullshit, you know, we are going to go on. And you saw what happened later on. You saw the consequences for the Spanish people who suffered a huge amount in the process. So here's, you know, an example where the government completely failed. And there are many others, and I agree with Aaron. So, but I'm just saying this prudential supervisor were not there, in a sense. Or in the case of Spain, they were overruled by the government. And that's it, you know, that's a sad thing. So I'm not sure, actually, you know, that the government will do the right thing with respect to that. But that raises an issue, which is, here's my proposal, and you know, it may be completely stupid, but I think we need to do something. That's what I'm convinced of that. Is to design a set of default rules that consumers will be familiar with. So basically, the idea is that there are default rules that consumers can use, 1, 2, and 3, and somehow with perhaps different exposure to data sharing and so on, but with codes of conduct and the like. So, you know, the idea being really to have some kind of standardized default rules which are familiar and displayed first. Now, I would call that libertarian paternalism because the platforms could still offer other rules. might try to convince the consumer that there are some of the rules which will be better. So it's not like, I don't want to restrict the platform's options too much, but I want to offer something to people like me who are completely incompetent and don't have the time to know roughly what I'm buying, or what I'm selling rather, when I give my data. Now, there's another question, which is, how do you design those default policies? And it could be a regulator assisted by external expert. Of course, you need a lot of industry input to do that. It could be some other thing, maybe some private trusted intermediaries, which will have a license, of course, will be regulated themselves. You don't want to notice that your trusted intermediary is actually a subsidiary of Facebook and Google, right? So yeah, that kind of stuff. Maybe a small number because you have to build a reputation or something like that. I don't have a solution for that, but I think we need some kind of default policies that consumers kind of understand. Okay, and there are a lot of challenges. How do you measure privacy cost? How do you rate counterparties to data trade? It's just like banking in a sense. So I go to Aaron and he's going to sell his data to Simon. Okay. I have to know not only about Aaron, but I need to know about Simon too, right? So do I trust him? And that kind of thing. Are those data unique? So if I don't give my data to Aaron, maybe those data are already given somewhere else. And then the cost to me is not the same as if I gave it only to Aaron, right? And so on and so forth. So there's a long list of things to think about. And the truth is that we social scientists haven't thought about it. And it's today, right? So the US is being passive, which I think is wrong. Europe is very proactive with things which are going to impose heavy regulation on the industry. So we need, and by the way, this is no fun for the platforms because the platforms will have different policies. We'll have to have the same policy somehow, but they will be facing different regulations, so it's not easy. Okay, and we need to improve regulatory processes, and that will be my last point. Oh, maybe I should keep on that. Let me just say a few words, nonetheless. There are drawbacks of classical approaches. So what are the classical approaches? Self-regulation by the industry, and let me tell you, this is self-serving. Competition policy is too slow, too late. It's very slow for the merchants and for the platforms which are going bankrupt. It's way too late. And utility regulation, I explained at the start of the talk, I don't really believe in for that particular application. So what do? I think we need something more reactive, where the industry makes proposals to regulators and regulators give their feedback on those proposals. They may not be the final response, so you may change your mind later on, but you incorporate that slowly into guidelines and rules. So some kind of ongoing process through which industry actually can innovate somehow, but is still regulated. Okay, so as to minimize the legal uncertainty, elicit the industry information. It exists already, and let me give you an example. I don't have time to go through all those things, but let me give you the example of a patent pool. Until 1945, every industry in the US was run by patent pools. Now, maybe you don't know what a patent pool is. A patent pool is when multiple intellectual property owners, so patent owners, get together and basically license together their intellectual property so that the users of the implementer of the technology will be able to have access to the bundle of patent they need. That's called a patent pool. Until 1945, all the high-tech industry of the time were run by patent pools. Automobile, airplanes, television, chemistry, and so on. They were all run by patent pools. 1945, the Supreme Court in the US says no more. We don't want that anymore. 1997, there was a proposal for a new patent pool, the MPEG-2 patent pool. By the way, you have, I don't know how many patent pools in your pocket. I mean, your pocket is full of patent pools. Your computer is full of patent pools. Okay? And then DOJ did the right thing. Basically, there was a business review letter and said, DOJ, Department of Justice, said, interesting. Let me make sure that I'm going to allow you to do that. You know, I may change my mind later on, but I'll allow you to do that if you have this covenant, this particular policy, which was called independent licensing, and then we added further policies, using economic theory and the like. But this was very reactive in a sense. You know, the industry went to see the DOJ. DOJ said, okay, that looks fine if you have this and this condition, and then it became some kind of rule, which then was adopted all over the world. That's very reactive, right? It's a kind of thing that, you know, it evolves over time because our knowledge evolves over time. So that's the kind of institution we want to have, okay? Okay, so let me stop here because then there are many other topics, and I breach on my promise, of course, we could predict. So there are big challenges for antitrust. I gave you a few illustrations of what we might want to do. In terms of data and privacy, I've argued that the government must assume its responsibilities. Maybe create default option, maybe you will have a better idea. And then we need to rethink regulation because things are moving so fast that we have to find new ways of regulating so that we don't kill innovation, right? We want to actually make sure there are no abuses of dominant position, there are no abuses relative to privacy, and many other things. But at the same time, we don't want to stop innovation, which is a big risk. So how do you do that? And, you know, my big thing, you know, I started with economics for the common good, is our job as an economist is really help achieve the common good. You know, we need to make this world a better place, and we need to help. And, you know, I apologize if it was a little bit of a pessimistic message. I'm an optimist, but, you know, we need actually to contribute to the common good. And, you know, here's a list of topics that, you know, maybe you will solve. Thank you very much. Oh, you know, in the book, I explain why economists are good at certain things, but they are terrible at forecasting. So you're asking me to foresee what you know, where price. I think it is going to, I mean, the fundamental stuff I mentioned, you know, the right to oblivion, the right blah, 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 it's still going to be around. Now, how much they will care about privacy will also depend on how much democracy there is. So one player I didn't discuss, of course, here is a government. And, you know, this is really a concern, that all your social network, for example, will be used to give you various ratings, right? Which may condition the kind of opportunities you have for work, for consumption, and so on, or for going abroad. So in our democracy, we will need very strong courts of law in order to protect privacy. The problem with courts of law, of course, and that was noticed by the European Union, is that they are very slow, extremely slow. I mean, I come from Southern Europe, so they are very slow. But in every country, they are slow. That's why we have arbitration in the first place, right? To try to improve things. But there is a real issue there. So my guess is there to stay. And for now, you know, I don't think we should overreact to the Facebook scandal, right? There will be other things which are going to happen. When we realize that, you know, we'll feel that's not right.
Your talk is focused on markets on the one hand, regulation on the other hand. And that defines the universal discourse, but there are other things outside of that. answer the question of national ownership, which you didn't mention. Now, are there circumstances, given the analysis you made here, where you think that nationalization might be the solution?
Nationalization of what? Of firms? I mean, I'm always a bit nervous about nationalizing things. I mean, it's not clear. I mean, in France, we tried to emulate Google. So there was a lot of money spent in creating a new search engine when Google was already strong. Guess what? Probably you don't know the French search engine. I've forgotten its name, actually. No, the Minitel was early on, but later on, in the year 2005, they started a search engine to compete with Google. And this industry, in one of the chapters of my book, chapter 13, I talk about industrial policy and the way to do it right and to do it wrong. So I'm not against any kind of nationalization, but in those kind of industries, I will be a little bit suspicious about it because things move very fast and you have to innovate a lot. It's not like what happened in China in the last 30 years, or in Japan or Korea after the war, or in France after the war. We had to rebuild the country in France after the war. You had to build roads, buildings, electricity. It's not rocket science, right? And then you can have actually industrial policy doing the job. But when it comes to startups and IT or biotechnology, I'm more reluctant to have the government involved. So I think my feeling is that I always talk about regulation, but I feel state should be strong in many dimensions, but should not be a player. It should be like a referee somehow. And I don't like too much a state being a player into various things because, the way it manages its operation is not always great. But it has to be a strong regulator, which is different. In banking and antitrust, in education, in everything. It has to be a very strong regulator. So it's a different conception of the state, I would say. But maybe I didn't answer your question.
One question I have is, when you mentioned booking the club, so in this case, what would be the optimal response in terms of regulation, and why it didn't happen yet?
Well, partly because I said again, the economists haven't done their homework. So if you want to, and first you have to identify a market failure. That has been identified by economists. But next, what do you do? What do you do about it? So in the case of credit card, we design a rule, which might be a possible response. But in the case of Booking or Amazon, nobody has defined such a rule. And so basically the policymakers in France, in the UK, or in Germany, they had no guidance from economists. And they identified there was an issue, they moved. Whether their move was optimal or not, probably not. But they felt they had to do something. So if we don't help them, they will just do something. So they just prohibited most favored nation clause. Sometimes you can have a narrow or broad most favored nation clause. So something which is done sometimes is that Booking cannot prevent Expedia from charging a lower price, but can prevent the hotel's website from charging a lower price. That's a narrow MFN. The broad MFN is what I talk about. But the idea being that, I go on to Booking, that's the showrooming argument. I go on to Booking, I find the hotel, and then I go to the hotel website. So that's possible. But in the end, it's not very satisfactory. I mean, it shows, that's the usual problem, and I'm guilty of that like anybody else, which is that we economists tend to react after the fact. And we don't anticipate enough what's going to happen. And we need to anticipate more because we want our policies to be relevant. I'm not saying working after the fact is useless, because the primes remain anyway. The financial crisis, what was done wrong, and so on. Some of the policy measures of Basel III were actually thought about before the crisis, not implemented. But there were new things which were thought after the crisis. So it's ongoing. I mean, the regulation prime of banks is not going to disappear. I can tell you in 100 years, it will still be around. That's just...
So I actually was listening 10 years ago. I was in the first generation of the economic investors and organizations in Louis.
Mm-hmm.
But I completely changed my field. I'm actually building research and participation method to run development projects. So I basically I have a past life of economics. And so the thing is, like, literally, I arrived 2 days ago. I was doing the logistic paperwork, and I thought that we were going to have to do. But my question is, so I don't do an economist job anymore. And when I started moving out of being an economist, I realized that we build a world of like, in a way, we have like keywords like efficiency. So we're really looking towards efficiency. And we have certain hypotheses that are built upon certain ideological values that shape the world in which we measure what we measure, or what we model through our models. But then I started, like, when I started talking with people with other disciplines, I realized that literally they had a completely different point of view, with a completely different set of values, and doesn't allow people to talk within, like, you cannot talk to people of other disciplines. So my question is, do you think it would be possible to build another modeling mindset, or another modeling world where we can, like, build a world with different values that people have another?
Okay, interesting. In my book, sorry to sell my... It's embarrassing, but...
We need to do that.
I spend a fair amount of time thinking about the morality of markets and the morality of economists. And it's true that, I mean, any of us, by talking to friends and family, and we realize we have very different viewpoints. Some of the attacks on economics are not quite fair, in the sense that many of the things we do actually is to deal with market failures. And lots of, what people have in mind, why don't you have babies for sale? Why don't you have kidneys for sale? Why don't you have this? Or many of the things have to do with externalities, have to do with internalities, have to do with various other things, which we actually deal with every day almost. So inequality itself is a market failure, right? If you are behind the veil of ignorance, probably you would like to live in a society which is more equal than the one you have now. I mean, you don't want to destroy incentives either, but, I think of inequalities just as being a market failure, partial market failure. You need some inequality, of course. But, that's the kind of thing that we... Now, then you have to think about things like, as I say, sale of organs, you have to think about prostitution, you have to think about various other things. And that's the kind of thing I try to discuss in the book. So to engage in a dialogue with actually non-economists. I started with colleagues, actually, an Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse you work on. It was in 2012. And the idea is to have actually institute not only economists, but sociologists, psychologists, historians, anthropologists, political scientists, lawyers, legal scholars, and so on. Just because we need this dialogue. Okay, not because we are imperialists, of course we are, but also because we need to have this dialogue, because otherwise we are going to be too insular, and we are not using the knowledge and the ideas that come up from other social sciences. We also have a unique tools, I think. both empirical and theoretical, which I think are very useful, and I'm willing to defend them very strongly. But at the same time, we also have to think about our place in society, and why is that? Is that our fault? Is that we have the wrong science? Or is that we don't explain things? Why is that we have so much difficulty in getting our message across? So I'm a strong believer, actually, of having this dialogue with other social scientists and with the broader society more generally.
There are two reasons that you don't even mention. The first one is that it's really hard to study Uber or Amazon or whatever if you don't have access to their data. And most of the time, if you want to study or read their data, they're going to say, well, you have to work with us, and you're going to have an employee at Uber or Amazon, and they make sure that the paper is the one you want. The second one is if you want to do this independent researches, and then you're going to have to match their salaries. And I think at least in France, it's very hard to have like salaries that match what you can get if you're supporting like Amazon and Google. So I'm wondering what kind of concrete steps you propose. Like, do you want them to give access to data for independent researchers, or?
That's a difficult one. In Toulouse, we have been working with industry for 30 years now. And it's always, we make it very clear from the start what we want, which is that, we publish whatever we want. There's no censorship. And, if they are not happy about it, fine, they won't renew the contract. And, of course, we have a self-selection of firms. Those who are willing to play the game, of course, are firms which are not going to ask you to do advocacy. Now, with data, it's harder, because they may not always want to give their data. And that's a complicated thing. So you cannot demand that private firms basically give their data, which are very, very helpful. You can try to go and get them, but obviously, that's what you say. We as social scientists should not be advocates for companies. So, if what we find favors them, that's fine. If it goes against what their interest, that's fine as well. And it's wherever science takes us, right? But I agree, it's true for empirical people actually to get access to those data. That's a difficulty. Now, data which are in part financed by the government, it's easier. You could request, that should be public in some way. But private data, it's not easy, right?